Working night shifts was never my ideal job, but times were tough, and I had to take what I could get. My workplace was in the suburbs, and to get home I had to drive through a dense forest. The forest was quiet and mysterious, especially at night when the darkness consumed everything around, and the only source of light was my car's headlights. I always felt a slight unease driving through that forest, but that night, my unease turned into sheer terror. It was a Friday night, and I finished work later than usual. It was already past midnight when I got into my car and started driving home. The road through the forest always seemed too long, but that night it felt endless. The headlights only illuminated a narrow section of the road, lighting up the trees whose shadows seemed like living creatures watching me. I was driving, trying to calm myself with music. The radio played a quiet melody, but suddenly the signal began to break up, and a strange static filled the airwaves. I switched the station, but all of them were equally filled with noise. Finally, I just turned off the radio and was left alone with the silence. After driving a few miles, I noticed something strange ahead. A figure stood on the roadside, dimly lit by my headlights. It was wearing a long coat and a hat, and it seemed to be staring right at me. My heart started pounding faster, but I thought maybe it was someone lost or in need of help. I slowed down and stopped next to the figure. Rolling down the window, I shouted, "Do you need help?" The figure didn't move or respond. I felt chills run down my spine. An inner voice was telling me to leave as quickly as possible, but curiosity got the better of me. I turned on my hazard lights and got out of the car. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out again. The figure slowly turned towards me. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I felt empty eyes staring at me. Suddenly it spoke, but the voice was strange, echoing as if coming from far away. "You shouldn't have stopped," it whispered. I stepped back, feeling fear grip my body. The figure took a step towards me, and I noticed that beneath the coat, there were no legs. It seemed to hover above the ground. In panic, I dashed back to the car, slammed the door shut, and hit the gas. The car sped forward, leaving the mysterious figure behind. I thought the worst was over, but I was wrong. After driving a few more miles, I saw the same figure again. It was standing in the middle of the road, and I had to slam on the brakes to avoid hitting it. The headlights illuminated its face, and I saw empty eye sockets, black as the night itself. "You can't leave," the same voice whispered. Terrified, I put the car in reverse, but the figure began to slowly approach. It seemed to glide over the ground without touching it. Suddenly the car stalled. I frantically tried to restart it, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The figure was almost upon me when I heard a knock on the window. "Don't try to leave," the voice was right outside the door. I froze, unsure of what to do. My heart was pounding so loudly it seemed like the whole forest could hear it. Suddenly the darkness outside thickened, and I felt the cold seep into the car. The figure disappeared, but I knew it was still there, somewhere nearby. Unexpectedly, the engine roared to life on its own. Without hesitation, I slammed on the gas and sped down the forest road. The car raced through the twists and turns, and I didn't dare look back. As I rounded another bend, I noticed the road starting to change. The trees began to twist unnaturally, and the shadows cast by the headlights took on terrifying shapes. Finally, I emerged from the forest and saw lights ahead. It was a motel that I had never noticed on this route before. With no other option, I decided to stop there and wait out the night. I parked and entered the motel. Inside, it was eerily quiet and empty. An old man with sad eyes sat at the reception. "I need a room," I said, trying to keep the tremble out of my voice. "Of course," he replied, handing me a key. "Just be careful." I climbed up to my room and immediately locked the door. The room had a strange atmosphere, and I felt the shadows on the walls begin to move. I decided not to turn off the light and lay down on the bed, trying to calm myself. In the middle of the night, I was awakened by a strange sound. It was a quiet, barely perceptible whisper coming from the corner of the room. I turned on the lamp and looked around. The room was empty, but the whispering didn't stop. It grew louder and clearer, and I realized it was coming from behind the wall. Gathering all my courage, I approached the wall and pressed my ear against it. The whisper was distinct and sinister. "You can't leave. You belong to us." I jumped back from the wall, feeling fear grip me once again. Suddenly, the light began to flicker. and the room filled with cold air. The same figure I had seen on the road began to slowly materialize from the corner. "You can't leave," it whispered, moving closer to me. I rushed to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The figure was almost upon me, and I felt its cold fingers touch my hand. In panic, I started screaming and banging on the door. Suddenly the light went out, and I was enveloped in complete darkness. When I came to, it was already morning. I lay on the floor of the same room, but the figure was gone. I ran out of the motel and jumped into my car, trying to get away from there as quickly as possible. Driving through the forest, I saw no more figures and heard no whispers. When I finally got home, I tried to forget everything that had happened, but the fear never left me. Every night I heard the faint whispering coming from behind the walls. It repeated the same words: "You can't leave. You belong to us." Years have passed since that night, but I still fear nighttime roads and forests. I know that something sinister is still watching me, and one day it will come for me again.
As I was driving home after a long day at work, the night seemed darker than usual. Perhaps it was the fatigue that intensified the darkness, or maybe it was a premonition. After only a couple of miles from the office, I noticed the fuel gauge dangerously dipping into the red zone. The forest road leading home was long and deserted, and I realized I would soon need to refuel. Driving through the dense forest, I finally saw a faint light in the distance. My car's headlights illuminated an old, run-down gas station. The station looked abandoned: rusty pumps, faded signs, and no one around. The only light came from the window of a small shop next to the pumps. I sighed with relief, deciding that even though it wasn't an ideal place, it was better than being stranded on a night road without gas. I stopped at one of the pumps and got out of the car. The cold night air wrapped around me, and I shivered, hoping the station was operational. I glanced at the shop and noticed the light inside was dim and flickering, like from an old lamp. I couldn't see anyone inside, but the door was slightly ajar. I walked over to the door and peeked inside. In the dim light, I saw a girl standing behind the counter. She looked strange. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her hair was long and disheveled. She lifted her eyes and looked at me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Her eyes were empty and lifeless, as if she were looking through me. "Excuse me, is the station open?" I asked, trying to hide my unease. The girl nodded but said nothing. I felt uncomfortable but decided to refuel the car and leave as quickly as possible. I returned to the pump and began filling the tank. Suddenly, I heard a faint whisper behind me. Turning around, I saw that the girl was standing right behind me, her face twisted in an unnatural grimace. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with an ominous warning. I froze in place, not knowing what to say. The thought crossed my mind that I should just get in the car and drive away as fast as possible. But something held me in place, forcing me to look into her lifeless eyes. "Leave before it's too late," she continued, her voice growing fainter and weaker. I felt the fear creeping up on me. I glanced at the fuel nozzle. The tank was full. Summoning my courage, I decided to ignore her words and headed for the car. Suddenly, the girl grabbed my arm. Her grip was cold as ice. I tried to pull away, but she held on tightly. Her eyes were filled with horror, and in that moment I realized she wasn't just trying to scare me. "They will come for you if you stay," she whispered. "Leave now." I broke free from her grip and ran to the car. My heart was pounding in my chest. I started the engine and drove away, leaving the gas station behind. In the rearview mirror, I saw the girl standing in the same spot, her eyes fixed on me. I drove along the forest road, hoping to reach the highway as soon as possible. But the fear wouldn't let me go. It felt as if something or someone was watching me. Suddenly, the engine sputtered, and the car came to a halt. I looked at the dashboard. The fuel was there, but the car wouldn't start. Then I heard a faint whisper coming from the forest. "Leave." The whisper grew louder, and I realized it was the same words the girl at the gas station had said. I got out of the car, trying not to look into the darkness of the forest, but the whisper was everywhere. It filled my head, making my heart race with terror. I decided to walk, hoping to find help. The forest around me seemed alive. Every shadow moved, every rustle made me jump. I walked without looking back until I saw the headlights ahead. It was a truck coming towards me. I waved my arms, trying to stop it. The truck stopped, and an old man with gray hair and kind eyes stepped out of the cab. He looked at me with surprise and asked, "What happened, son?" I told him about the gas station and the strange girl. He listened to me attentively and then nodded. "You're not the first one to tell this story," he said. "Many years ago, there was a terrible murder at that gas station. The girl was named Lily. She was killed right at her workplace. Since then, her spirit can't find peace and warns those who come there to leave." I felt a chill run down my spine. Everything that happened seemed unbelievable, but I knew it was true. The driver offered to take me home, and I agreed. We drove along the forest road, and I felt the fear slowly fade away. When we reached the highway, I looked back at the forest behind us. The shadows of the trees seemed less menacing, but I knew I would never forget that night. The girl from the gas station and her warnings would stay with me forever. And every time I pass that old gas station, I will remember her empty eyes and cold fingers gripping my arm. I've always loved nighttime drives. The roads seemed endless in the darkness, and the twinkling lights of oncoming cars reminded me that life continued even during the hours when most people were asleep. That evening, I was returning home after a long day at work. As I navigated through a dense forest, I suddenly realized I was beginning to fall asleep at the wheel. Deciding it was better to stop and rest than risk my life, I turned off at the nearest motel that conveniently appeared. Motel was old and dilapidated, as if it had stepped right out of a horror movie. The sign flickered and seemed like it was about to go out completely. Despite its rundown exterior, I decided it would be a good place to spend the night and get some rest before continuing my journey. Parking my car in the empty lot, I walked inside. The receptionist, an elderly man with thick white hair and deep wrinkles, looked up from the book he was reading by the light of a small lamp. "Good evening," he said with a slight smile. "How can I help you?" "I need a room for the night," I replied, feeling the weariness in my voice. He nodded and, taking a key from the shelf behind him, handed it to me. "Room 7 on the second floor. We also have a small diner if you want to eat before bed." I thanked him and headed to my room. The long hallway with faded wallpaper and creaky floors seemed to echo times gone by. Opening the door, I saw a modest room with a single bed, an old TV, and a small table. Dropping my things on the bed, I decided to grab some food before hitting the sack. The diner was small but cozy, with wooden tables and chairs covered in checkered tablecloths. A middle-aged woman with a kind face stood behind the counter. I ordered a sandwich and a cup of coffee, then sat at one of the tables by the window. As I ate, another patron entered the diner, a man in worn-out clothes with a tired look. He sat at the table next to mine and nodded a greeting. We exchanged a few words about the road and the weather before it was time to return to our rooms. Back in my room, I felt the fatigue hit me with renewed force. Deciding to sleep, I kicked off my shoes and fell onto the bed. Suddenly, my phone rang. I looked at the screen, an unknown number. Thoughts of it being an urgent work call ran through my mind, and I answered. "Hello," I said, but only a whisper, barely audible and eerie, came from the other end. "Who is this?" The whisper grew louder and clearer, turning into words: "You shouldn't have come here. Leave while you still can." A chill ran down my spine. "Who is this? What do you want?" I asked, but the line went dead. Trying to calm myself, I put the phone on the nightstand and lay back down. Deciding it must have been a prank or a mistake, I tried to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. I kept feeling like I was being watched. Finally, I got up, went to the window, and looked outside. In the distance, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest. It didn't move, just stared toward the motel. Trying to shake off the eerie feeling, I went back to bed but couldn't sleep. Time seemed to drag on painfully slowly. Then the phone rang again. This time, true fear gripped me. Answering the call, I heard the same whisper: "You can't leave. He won't let you go." I decided I had to leave immediately. Quickly dressing, I packed my things and left the room. The hallway seemed endlessly long, and even more terrifying in the nighttime silence. On the stairs, I ran into the receptionist. "Is something wrong?" he asked, raising his eyebrows in surprise. "I need to leave," immediately I said, trying not to show my fear. He just nodded without asking any questions. I left the motel and ran to my car. The figure at the edge of the forest was still there, watching me. My heart pounded as I got into the car and started the engine. After driving a few miles, I finally stopped, trying to calm myself. My breathing was ragged and my hands were shaking. Remembering the whispers on the phone, I decided to check my call log. Opening it, I realized there were no records of those calls. No missed calls, no incoming calls. I was sure it hadn't been a dream. But who or what was trying to warn me? Deciding not to return, I drove on, feeling unseen eyes watching me. That night I realized one thing: the forest and the motel held a dark secret that was better left undiscovered. After driving a few more miles, I saw a roadside cafe and decided to stop for coffee to calm my nerves. Walking inside, I felt a bit better. There were a few patrons and a friendly waitress stood behind the counter. Ordering a coffee, I sat by the window and pondered what had happened. Suddenly, the door opened and the same man from the motel diner walked in. He sat at the table next to mine and, noticing me, nodded. "Didn't expect to see you again," he said with a slight smile. I nodded back, feeling the tension ease a bit. We started talking again, and I told him about the strange calls and the figure by the forest. He listened intently, not interrupting. "You know," he said when I finished, "this place has a bad reputation. They say spirits of those who died here many years ago haunt the forest. Many of them can't find peace and try to warn the living about their fate." Listening to him, I realized my encounter with the mysterious voice and the figure by the forest was no coincidence. Maybe it was a warning, and I was lucky to have left in time. After that encounter, I never drove through that forest at night again. Each time I passed by, I remembered that eerie night and the whispers on the phone. Sometimes it seems like I still hear them, especially on quiet nights when the wind rustles the trees. Years have passed, but that event has remained etched in my memory. I've learned to heed warnings and not ignore my intuition. And each time I pass by that forest, I feel a chill of fear, remembering those eerie words: "You can't leave. He won't let you go."